Graham again, candidate for United States Senate here in Iowa. This is another one in our series of specialty forums so that we have an opportunity to do a little more of a deep dive into a particular topic of very high importance. It would be difficult to find a topic that's more important than today's topic because this topic will affect our ability to survive on this planet and affects I think that the planet will probably figure out a way to survive, but I'm not sure that we will figure out a way to survive on it as it continues to adapt to the things we're doing to it. So this is a really, really important conversation. It is one of the top 3 issues that I talk about most in our campaign. We talk about a universal single-payer healthcare program. Some people call it Medicare for All because that is the most just and the most financially efficient way to provide healthcare to citizenry. We talk about the climate crisis, and we're going to talk about that in depth today. And I also talk about investments in families and children. I've been an attorney for kids for the last 20 years and also for mostly single women, parents in poverty in juvenile court for most of my career. And I learned recently that although I could see with my own eyes that the investments in children and families have been decreasing in the 20 years that I've been an attorney and a guardian ad litem, it's really been really remarkable in the last several years, especially that the funding isn't there for the programs that we need. And I found out that the United States spends less than 1%, 0.6% of our GDP on programs for families and children. And the rest of the developed world spends somewhere between 2 and 3%, depending on the country, of their GDP on programs for families and children. So we are really falling far behind on our investments in kids. And that's everything from things like paid leave for families so that they can stay home with their kids for a few months after their children are born or adopted, all the way up to childcare and how most people in this country, unless they're pretty well off, can't really afford childcare. And then we don't have enough subsidies available for people who are in lower income brackets and want to work but can't afford the childcare to be able to work. That's a huge problem. And every other developed nation has some kind of a childcare subsidy or universal childcare, and the U.S. doesn't. So those are some of the issues that we talk about. But today we're here to talk about the climate, and I'm very excited to have this conversation in particular. We are very fortunate and very grateful to have the endorsement of the Iowa Sunrise Movement and then also the chapters in Dubuque and Iowa City and Cedar Rapids. And this is just an issue that is so incredibly important to me, and I need to be better educated about it, but I'm somewhat educated about it a little bit, enough to know that the best time to address this was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now, as they say, right? The best time to plant a tree was, yeah. So we've got to make massive, aggressive action, immediate action on the climate crisis. From where I sit anyway, and you are all more experts than I, so you can all tell me whether my perception is right or not. I'm just not seeing it, even from Democrats. I'm not actually seeing meaningful action on the climate crisis. I hear a lot of talking about it, of course, more so by Democrats, but I can't really point to any legislation and say, this is really a great step in addressing the climate crisis. So I don't think we're really doing anything. I think we're in the talking about it a lot stage. I want to very, very briefly recognize each of our guests and just very briefly introduce them. I apologize if your introduction, if it's not exactly what you want, but you'll get the chance to introduce yourself and say whatever you want. So we have Emily Manders. She's a 4th year student at the University of Iowa studying environmental policy and planning. Her work in climate activism movement includes being co-president of the University of Iowa Environmental Coalition, director of sustainability for the University of Iowa Student Government, and student representative on the University of Iowa Sustainability Presidential Charter Committee. So welcome, Emily.
Thank you for having me.
And we have Phil, is it Engen?
Yes, it is.
Woohoo! Okay. For the last 18 months, Phil's been the leader of the Cedar Rapids chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. Phil, did I just talk to you like an hour ago?
No, you didn't.
That was a different chapter. That was
a different chapter. I think that was, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think maybe it was the Iowa City chapter I was talking to. I just had a confab with them a little while ago, which Citizens Climate Lobby is an organization with over 400 US chapters dedicated to solving climate change by taking the first big step of putting a price on carbon emissions and refunding that money directly to citizens in the form of a monthly check. And he's also a software developer at Collins Aerospace. And Mike Carberry is former Johnson County, Iowa supervisor. He has Green State Solutions. He's okay. They didn't do a very good. I'm going to make you introduce yourself, Mike, because in just a moment, because they didn't do a very good job. I know a lot of, but it's just like written in a really herky-jerky way. So I'll probably have you introduce yourself.
I wear about 10 hats, so that's.
I know.
No problem.
Yep. And I know he's also a regenerative agriculture consultant as well, which is a super, super important piece of this. And one of the ways that Iowa can actually lead the world in the way that we address the climate crisis. So we're going to hear a lot from Mike about that. Bridget Williams is the leader of the Sunrise Movement Cedar Rapids. Bridget has worked with the city of Cedar Rapids and Lynn County to develop important climate crisis resolutions. And she works with Sunrise members to develop local, state, and initiatives for a sustainable and accessible future. And then Ayla, who was inspired by Greta Thunberg's climate strikes, began a Cedar Rapids weekly climate strike to raise awareness about the climate change and advocate for change in policies to build a sustainable future for her generation. She's a student at Mount Mercy and is minoring in environmental justice and involved with the Sunrise Movement. I also was lucky to meet Ayla's dad. He's really cool. So P.S. by the way, he's a public school teacher, isn't he, Ayla? Yep. So anyway, let's dive in. Mike, I'm just gonna, since I didn't have a full good introduction for you, can you tell us a little bit more about you and all the hats you've worn and things you have done, and then kind of launch us off on, I'm sure this is gonna buckle in everyone, because we only have like an hour and a half, and we have way too much to cover.
That's right. Kimberly, thanks for having me on, and it's great to be on the panel with so many distinguished activists that are working on really the most important issue of our lifetime, in many lifetimes. I was raised just west of Cedar Rapids. My dad was a large animal veterinarian, and I was his kind of right-hand man. So my job after school and on Saturdays was to help him on those independent family farms. And that's kind of where I got my start in really sustainable agriculture from those independent family farms. That was before we monocropped just corn and beans, and that's before we had CAFOs. So I became a political activist as a young adult, but in the year 2000, I had supported Bill Bradley, and he won Johnson County, was the only thing that he won. But then he got out of the race after New Hampshire, and Al Gore was our nominee in 2000. So every candidate has a book for president. Al Gore's book was 4 years old. It was called Earth in the Balance. I read it. At the time, I was a long-haired antique dealer, political activist, and it completely changed my life. And so I have worked on climate change fighting, renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, clean water, CAFO issues for 20 years. I took a 4-year detour into being an elected official. So I really respect, Kimberly, your gumption to actually run for public office. It's not easy. You have to wear a bulletproof vest a lot of times. And so I really thank you. Right now I started my own consulting firm, I guess 15 years ago, Green State Solutions. And what that does is I basically do contract work on organizing, outreach, and lobbying on these sustainable issues. I'm currently working for the Iowa Farmers Union on Regenerative Agriculture Climate Project, and also the Organic Consumers Association and their farmers and ranchers for a Green New Deal. And I've started kind of a coalition called Regeneration Iowa that's just starting to get its feet off the ground. We're working on a couple things. One of them is the CAFO issue, and as it relates to slaughterhouses and COVID-19. That issue is just so much, in the news. So that's kind of my introduction and what I'm doing. But I mean, if there's a climate fight or an environmental fight in Iowa in the last 20 years, I've probably been knee deep in it.
Excellent. Well, I guess I would like to kind of start with, so this just actually comes from my conversation that I just had like an hour and a half ago with Citizens Climate Lobby. I think it was the Iowa City chapter, I think, Phil. And you know, I try really hard, but Mike knows this, like when you run for office, especially United States Senator, there's almost no issues that you aren't supposed to know everything about. And there's no way you can do that. Like, there's no way you can be an expert on every single issue. And I don't even pretend to be. I do think that when you're faced with a piece of legislation, that's when you have to do your best to become an expert. I mean, and you need to have a working level of knowledge across a lot of different areas of people's lives. But I had not yet read the Energy Innovation Act. And so I'm guessing that Phil probably has.
Yes, I have.
And so because I just talked to a chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby an hour and a half ago about that topic, I'm interested in learning more and hearing more. And my understanding, anybody feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, is that the people that are advocating for that particular piece of legislation, at least the ones I talked to today, are not saying this is a replacement for the Green New Deal, or this is, you know, this is the only thing we should do. They're just saying this is one thing we can do, and that it's already garnered some reasonable amounts of support from more than just Democrats, funny enough. And so this might be a start. This is something, like I just said, so far I'm getting a big zero. I'm not seeing a lot of actual movement or laws or anything that's really helping us address the climate crisis in a big way. So I'd like to have a discussion about kind of the Energy Innovation Act and just all of your takes on that and how it fits into the puzzle or the framework, or if it doesn't, or if you believe that it doesn't and why, you know, whatever the different opinions are on that. I'm very curious to hear. And we all have to keep it civil. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So I'll just give you a really brief overview of what the bill is. And this is an actual bill introduced into the House of Representatives in this session. In the previous session of Congress, it was introduced into both the Senate and the House of Representatives. And this bill has a few lines have changed since the previous session of Congress, but it's effectively the same bill. It is called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And that long name is important because there's two sides of the puzzle. The first one is, and I want to come back to something you just said really quickly here, and that is one reason I love the Green New Deal is because it provides us a sense of scale to the problem. It is a very large issue with a huge vision, and it's like, okay, this is what we've got to do. But then we've got to go, okay, what are the steps? What are the pieces to make this grand vision happen? And so then we've got to boil it down to what are pieces of legislation that we can enact that make this vision become real, because it becomes real when it becomes law. So I look at the Energy Innovation Act as the first step of the Green New Deal. And I want to direct anyone who hasn't heard of En-ROADS at climateinteractive.org to just Google En-ROADS. That's with an E. And it's got a great simulator on there. It's in beta right now, but it's been out there for several months. Play with it, it's fun. But anyway, the huge key is that all economists agree that we are not going to get anywhere if we don't solve the problem of a huge subsidy that we provide to energy users, and that includes you and me, in that we get to pollute for free. And that is an unpriced market externality, which is a big word that just says, hey, we get to do something, we don't have to pay for it. But it hurts everybody a little bit, tragedy of the commons, that kind of thing. And this pricing of carbon emissions is the first biggest step we can do. You often hear that we don't have a silver bullet for solving climate change. We need a silver shotgun. But this is probably the biggest piece of buckshot that we have in that shotgun shell. And with a carbon price alone that is steadily rising, it encourages people and companies to switch from carbon intensive to carbon neutral or carbon negative manufacturing and products and distribution. What it also does is the other side of that. So the first side is we reduce carbon emissions by putting a fair price on what that pollution is causing in our world. The second part of it is that that's going to raise prices. It's going to make things more expensive. That transition, and it's a transition, and it won't be forever, but it'll take a generation, is going to have costs associated with it. Some things will be expensive, some things will be cheap. However, how do we pay for these? Well, you and I go to the store and we look at two competing products and we say, well, this one's more expensive than this other one. Other than that, they seem the same. I'm going to buy the cheaper one. The cheaper one was made with renewable energy because it didn't have to pay the price on carbon. So all of a sudden there becomes an incentive for us to just buy the cheaper option, which is what most consumers do. But if I can't find a cheaper option, I have to pay that implied price inside the product, and I get a check every month to help me adjust, help me fund that transition to a green economy. The beautiful part of it is a refund that comes the same to every person in the country is naturally progressive. If I get $1,000 a month, it's kind of like universal basic income. We've started to hear a lot about that. If I get $1,000 a month and I make $1,000 a month, that's a huge deal for me. If I make $10,000 a month and I get $1,000 a month, well, it's nice, but it's not life-changing. But that helps all of us transition from our carbon-heavy economy to a carbon-neutral or carbon-negative economy. Lots of pieces in it, but the core is it needs to become law, and the best way to make it become law is something that is bipartisan. And we talk about bipartisanship, but we have to, it really becomes more stable legislation when it has been accepted by both parties. And so there are many pieces of this legislation that address things like a border adjustment, which is it maintains our competitive stake in the world by making sure that we don't just move our carbon intensive industries offshore, because we'll deal with that when the product is re-imported back into the country. So that's a 3-minute version of what the bill is, but I look at it as the first step of the Green New Deal, and that's where Green New Deal becomes legislation. And having a price on carbon actually lets a lot of other things sort of naturally fall into place. The next steps become easier after we get the first one in place.
So just so I understand, so I'm really clear. So this is not just a price on carbon for, say, Exxon, just to name a company. This is a price on carbon that Kimberly-Graham has to pay too. Is that correct?
Yes, but not directly, only indirectly. So we only, the bill only puts the price at the wellhead. So when the fossil fuel comes out of the ground through at a mine, for a coal mine, or at an oil well, or at a port of entry if it's coming off of a ship or a pipeline, that's when that tax applies. So really it's only about 1,000 entities that need to be taxed in the country. That money is taken in by the US government, processed, they keep 2% for processing and send 98% back out to the people to be able to afford the increased price that is passed on to the consumer because the price of energy went up.
Okay, I think I follow. So some of my questions about that would be, I just sort of see a never-ending upward spiral where if we don't have hard limits on carbon emissions at the same time, I don't know, does this bill have hard limits on carbon emissions incorporated into it?
So there is an increasing scale. So the first year, there are slightly different versions of the bill that have been introduced, and when it gets through committee, it's making sausage. It's going to look a little different at the end. But as it starts right now, it would start with $15 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted. So we know if we burn a gallon of gasoline, we know exactly how much carbon is emitted from that. It's simple science. And so that price ends up the first year at $15 a ton is about 10 cents per gallon of gas, nine and a bit. And so we would see that extra price of gas at the pump. Also, companies would see it in their price of electricity as coal-powered electricity would become more expensive. Wind-powered energy would not become more expensive. But coal-powered electricity powers factories. The factories make the product. They increase the price of the product slightly because they had to pay for the carbon fee.
So instead of passing that on to the consumer, though, couldn't that legislation have a part where it makes that illegal? So that the corporations basically let it eat into the corporations billions of profits rather than passing that on to the consumer and doing these gyrations and hip and skips to try to get that money back into the pockets of people who can't afford to pay the increase?
Well, one of the things I love about the Energy Innovation Act is that it's very simple in its administration, and administration becomes the nightmare. And so by only having to assess the fee on approximately 1,000 corporations, it makes it very easy to administer. The Social Security Administration is really good at sending out checks every month to millions and millions of people. So the processes are already in place to handle this. By putting a hard cap on something like cap and trade or whatever, you can create economic shocks to our country. And we want to avoid a shock. We want it to be a transition that we can see coming. But so you and I, are just like companies, and we look ahead and we say, I'm going to buy a new car, and I'm going to keep this car for 10 years, and this is what it's going to cost me over the life of the vehicle. Well, companies do that too. They can plan because they know what their prices are going to be in 10 years. So rather than a hard stop, making something illegal, handling it with regulation, we handle it with plain economics. And I would say that pretty much every economist that you speak to will say this is the best first action we can take on reducing our carbon emissions as a country and as a world, because actually the dominoes fall. Many other countries already do this. Our trading partners would be heavily incentivized to follow our lead.
Yeah, my concern is just kind of having a general social justice background. My concern is that I'm awfully skeptical when we just say to a wealthy billion-dollar profitable corporation, pay more money. They'll just say, okay, where do I send the check?
Yes,
And
they
they'll
do.
just keep doing what they're doing.
Sure, but their competitors may not. And now there becomes a competitive differential between the companies that switch and the companies that don't. So the company that doesn't make any status quo, they keep doing their thing, their prices keep increasing every year until they go out of business. And the companies that come in and they, the brewery that uses wind power, all of a sudden can sell their beer cheaper than the company that's just pulling electricity off the grid, or whatever. So the beautiful part about this too is that 70% of households come out ahead of the game on that. They receive more money every month than they pay out in increased prices. The poorer you are, the better off you come out in this plan. If you're in the top 30%, you're a little worse off. If you're in the top 1%, you're a lot worse off, because the richer you are, the more carbon you produce.
Okay, cool. My other concern is something that you just kind of alluded to there, saying, hey, if one company does this and the other company doesn't, then that ultimately, and I'm reading into some of what you said, but ultimately maybe that company who doesn't do it is going to go out of business because they're not going to be able to. They're going to have to charge so much for their products. Nobody's going to buy their products. They're going to be out. My concern, though, is whenever you say something like that company's going to be out potentially, and we're not antitrust legislation, and we are allowing these monopolies to grow larger and larger and larger. If we end up with only, instead of 1,000 entities, if we end up with 100 entities because they've all merged and combined, and we've allowed that because we typically do, unfortunately, in this country, we don't do a good job of breaking up monopolies and enforcing antitrust legislation, then what? Then my fear is, and by the way, none of what I'm saying is saying Energy Innovation Act is crap, we shouldn't do it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just having a conversation. If we end up with only a few companies then now offering gas or whatever, name something, then we're screwed, because then they can charge whatever they want, and we only have a few games in town, which is the problem our farmers have. Our farmers only have a few games in town for their inputs, their outputs, their fertilizer, their seed, the price of their commodity, and they're screwed because now they just basically have to do what they're told. So
right.
How do you or is there any discussion of, I guess I'm a person that always likes to look at things all the way to their logical conclusion, right? And when I look at this down
Yep. All the way to the logical conclusion is that we will have zero fossil fuel companies. all fossil fuel companies will be out of business or they transition to something else, because the goal is to get to zero fossil fuels. So while we have 1,000 entities that we would need to assess the fee on today, that will need to drop to zero over time. Now, when I say one company goes out of business, I'm talking about a t-shirt manufacturer, so, or a brewery. It's not one of the 1,000. It's one of the million companies that has increased prices and where they get their power from. So the company that says, you know what, I see this coming, I'm going to coat my plant and my parking lot. I'm going to have shaded parking for my employees because the solar panels are going to take the sun instead of heating up your car during the day. That company gets a payback on their solar investment, and they get away from the electric utility because now they've got the free energy of the sun. So there's that incentive, a huge incentive to go to wind and solar by the individual, and it releases the grip of the utility companies from us, and also provides an incentive for all companies to do likewise.
Cool. Does this put any kind of a price on biomass, biofuels, or nuclear?
So biomass, yes, because carbon is priced, and biomass is considered carbon neutral by the EPA. And so while there is debate on exactly whether that's true or not, this act, I see you, Mike. There's a couple things that some people don't like about this bill, and one of them, there's a couple carve-outs. One is that we say, you know what, biomass is better than what we got, so we'll take it. And you know, it's like, call this version 1, and not to say that there can't be a new bill passed down the road that says, oh, you know, maybe we learned a little bit more about that, we're only going to give a 75% credit for biomass, whatever. The second carve-out that's of note is the agricultural carve-out. And because farmers even though farmers are manufacturers of food in a sense, they have very little control over their supply chain and their distribution chain. And so for this version of the bill, farming fuels are exempt from the fee. And so they can drive the tractor on the farm and dry their crops using carbon pricing free fossil fuels. If they dry a neighbor's crop, they don't get that benefit.
Okay.
So there's a small carve out there, but it represents about 2% of our carbon emissions.
Got it. Mike, go.
Yeah. Phil, I have studied the fee and dividend bill for over 10 years. For 20 years, I've been fighting what I call false climate change solutions. Now, you quoted Bill McKibben earlier about no silver buckshot or no silver bullet. That's his quote. And he says, but there may be silver buckshot. So you were talking about a shotgun. It's the same thing, but that's a Bill McKibben quote. And I follow this drawdown book has 100 different ways to fight climate change, and it doesn't mention a carbon tax. Biomass is, burning is burning, and we need to quit burning stuff. And it doesn't matter that we can grow some of the things back in a year, like the sugar cane or miscanthus or something like that. We're still putting CO2 into the air. Biofuels is the biggest scam ever perpetrated upon the American public, and nuclear power, and Bill McKibben said, nuclear power is like burning $100 bills for fuel. Those three things include, and then other things like waste to energy and burning trash. I mean, they burn trash in Ames and they do it in Cedar Falls. There's so many false climate change solutions. And if we really just incentivize more the good ones, then they would be much more price competitive. But if you leave a loophole for biomass, biofuels, and nuclear, they will remain price competitive versus wind and solar and hydro. And this is a free market system, and the free market will find those loopholes, and then we'll be burnt. Everything that's alive in this planet or country, if it's just a nationwide bill, is free game for fuel. And if you watch that very poor documentary that came out on Earth Day, Planet of the Humans, I mean, he attacks biomass and biofuels, rightly so. He uses some really bad examples and data. I mean, it's really a slanted film, But then he also goes after the Sierra Club on biomass, and also Bill McKibben and a few others. And biomass is not the answer. And this bill, I would be much happier if, it could be amended, Phil. And so as it currently stands, I don't think the fee and dividend bill is going to be the answer. Renewable energy getting to 100% and then drawing down carbon with regenerative agriculture. Right now agriculture puts out 25% to a third of our greenhouse gases. Depends on how you measure it. If measure the transportation, the sale of food, and also then, the decomposition of food, about a third of the food that we produce in this country is never eaten. So to me, I'm just not a big fan of this bill. I think there are better ways. I mean, it would be a start, but why go half a loaf? Why not amend the bill first?
So the issue is legislation that is introduced as a bill is worthless. Only legislation that passes is worth anything. Yeah. So you've got to get it passed. And so in order to get something passed, you have to make your slice as wide as you can, but you've got to keep it narrow enough that you can get it passed. Hence the agricultural carve out. Okay. Regenerative agriculture, wonderful thing. Totally love it. Okay. But that's for a different bill. Honestly, it's just for a different bill. It's not that the Carbon Dividend Act doesn't like it. It's just that it's too big of a piece to include in this bill. That's why there's legislation to come, okay? But we got to get this one passed. If you want to look at the Climate Leadership Council, where 3,589 US economists, 27 Nobel laureate economists all have a statement on carbon dividends, which is short term for this, they're all in favor of it. As far as biomass, just back to that, biomass doesn't get a free pass. If I'm burning fossil fuels to make biomass fuel, I've got to pay the carbon fee on the fossil fuels that I burn to make the biomass fuel. So it works itself in. So if there's a net scientific benefit for it, it doesn't get the fee.
If you're using energy to cut down trees, that's fine. You're going to get taxed on the, say the diesel or the gasoline that runs what cuts down the trees. Yep. But once you burn that biomass, there's no tax on that biomass produced. You can produce electricity with biomass. You can do biogases. You could do all sorts of different things, and none of that is taxed. So, yeah.
I think the idea is you plant another tree.
Yeah. I think that's why. And you know what? You just said some magical words there, Phil. Plant another tree.
If we had enough space to plant enough trees, that'd be great. But we have to cut down the tree. We have to cut down a tree and grow another one because there's not enough land on the planet to absorb all the carbon dioxide.
Have you been to Wyoming?
Can I jump in here, Kimberly?
Go ahead, Bridget.
I just want to say that you're going to hear this argument over and over within the environmental community. And I see both perspectives on it. And Phil knows so much more about the carbon dividend than I do. So I'm just going to start off with that right off the bat. But Phil's looking at what you're talking about, Kimberly, people in power who are not trying to restructure the system, who are not trying to stop us from giving fossil fuel companies over $20 billion in direct state and federal subsidies a year. We're looking at people who are not trying to electrify everything. We're looking at people in power who have the fossil fuel companies in their back pocket. And so I see what Phil is looking at this carbon dividend as a bipartisan solution to get people on board. And I think that it supplements the Green New Deal, just like he's saying. I will say that I think it's important that a carbon dividend is high enough to make a dent in emissions. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, carbon fees are often too low to make a dent in emissions. And that's likely because companies are involved in creating that legislation. So I think that what Phil is talking about is a piece of the Green New Deal, but it's very important that we get people in power who want to restructure the system, who want to stop taking fossil fuels out of the ground, so that we can get to, so that we can decrease carbon almost 50% by 2030 and get to net zero by 2050.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's why it's so important that we elect people who both understand the value of getting some forward traction. You know, I've mediated people's divorces for 17 years now. I'm also a mediator. If you want to do something that requires you to have people reach agreements on difficult issues, try mediating their divorce. People's children, all of their money, their home, that's the things you're trying to get them to reach agreements on. So it's pretty highly emotional. And so I understand it's like sometimes it has to be both and, you know, we need the Energy Innovation Act. The devil is always in the details. So we need somebody as our United States Senator who's sitting there reading till 4 a.m. and then calling up Phil and Mike and Bridget and Ayla and Emily and saying, I'm reading this on page 6, Phil, what do you think? Or I'm reading this on page 12, Mike, I don't know. You know, somebody who's willing to listen to people that know more than they do. Believe me, I'll have climate scientists on speed dial and I will listen to what they tell me. My concern, again, it is not to say I don't agree with it, with that bill. It's to say a concern that we have to stay vigilant about is this. For those of us old enough to have bought a house, here's something that we all probably can relate to instantaneously. You move in and you say, I really hate that pink wall. I need to paint that. Or these old floors need replacing, but I need to move in now. So I'm not going to replace the floors. When did you get around to replacing the floor? Right before you sold the house 15 years later, meaning either right before you sold it when it had to get done, or never. And that is my concern about these kind of transition steps. It's not that I don't think they have value. It's not that I wouldn't vote for them. It's that we have to stay on high alert that this is in no way good enough, and that we can't let fossil fuel companies or any companies get away with saying, well, we did that Energy Innovation Act, go away, we're good. You know what I mean? We can't stop there. We can't stop there. And we have to just make sure that we don't stop there. What do you think, Emily? Oh, go ahead, Bridget.
I also just want to add that, you know, we're not having these same kind of little debates and conversations when we're facing COVID-19 or when we were facing World War II. We weren't spending the same amount of time. We should be treating this crisis like a war effort, and we should be, you know, for example, if you were to call me and say, I'm thinking about saying yes to the carbon dividend, what do you think? I'd say, let's pass it, what's next? You know what I mean? I think we just need to get started. And so it just doesn't make sense for us to have these it makes sense to have these debates internally and talk about what's really going to make a difference, but it doesn't make sense to stop there.
Yeah. Emily, what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Bridget, and this is a start, but this is a start of conversation that needs to like go on. And so passing this is like opening it up for a future of like the new Green New Deal and like better legislation that can help our environment. Yeah, but like getting bipartisan support is just really important. So just opening up conversations is great. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think having discussions like this where we, you know, you all are far more educated than I am, but by having these kinds of forums that people are watching now and that are going to watch this video later, it helps them become more educated about these discussions and learning some of the nuance, and it just helps us all, everyone, become more fluent in kind of the language, right? And in knowing what we need to do and by when and how different options, or not options, but different puzzle pieces that all need to come into play, fall into place for us to get where we need to go. What do you think, Ayla?
I agree strongly with Bridget. I do think that this is something that if we were to pass this bill, I think that it would go two ways. I think either people will think this is good, we did something, I'm done now, the fight is over. I think that it also could go with this is a good way to get bipartisan support and people use it as a way to build hope and keep going. I guess I just worry in a lot of the older generation, it seems, in my personal experience, it seems like as soon as they do or we do one good thing, it's we're saved, that's enough. But I agree with Bridget that this is incredibly urgent and it's not the time to be moving slowly. I think it's fine to do it piece by piece, but it needs to be rapidly. And again, I'm not an expert on anything. This is my personal experience, but I think that it just seems that often the more we break it up, the slower it moves. So I think that if we're going to do it piece by piece, it needs to be very rapid fire. And we need to do it in a way that gains support and doesn't stall.
And,
Yeah,
and one thing that,
absolutely.
just one last kind of thought I want to add on this topic, and that I think will transition us to another really important conversation about the climate crisis, is that we need to be very careful with these workers' livelihoods. So I question leaving their livelihoods up to the market, and when a fossil fuel company or a company that's emitting carbon goes out of business because of the carbon dividend, do we have a plan for those workers? I mean, that's the reason why I'm a strong advocate, of course, for transitioning fossil fuel companies to renewable energy companies, to transitioning these workers to renewable energy jobs as soon as possible. Because, I mean, the biggest kind of misconception I think about the work that we're doing is that we're not about workers' rights, and that we're about, you know, getting these fossil fuel workers out of work, when in reality I'm focused on the company, I'm focused on the CEO. And so I think it's really important for us to keep at the front of mind workers' livelihoods and how we're going to ensure that for them.
Bridget, I'd like to make one little comment on that. I read something recently that the fracking boom resulted in approximately 130,000 new fracking wells, and it created, you know, a lot of jobs, a lot of economic prosperity in like North Dakota and some other states and that kind of thing. And you know, good or bad, that's what it did. I also read that we need 140,000 windmills in the United States to electrify or to completely supply our electricity with wind. 130,000, 140,000. We drilled 130,000 wells in 10 years because there was an economic incentive to do it. Could we build 140,000 windmills in 10 years because there's an economic incentive to do it? There's your worker transition. Instead of drilling a well, build a windmill. It's
100%.
very similar.
100%, but I think until we take away these subsidies from fossil fuel companies, and until we seriously subsidize and prioritize and coordinate renewable energy, I just don't think it's going to happen on the scale that's required. I mean, solar and wind have gotten cheaper and more widespread in the past, I don't know, 20, 30 years, and yet they're not making up the larger proportion of energy. So I see what you're saying. I do think that it has to be prioritized in a coordinated way, because I just worry that the market's not gonna make it happen. And I mean, sorry, now I'm like ready to go, and it wasn't just the market that made it happen. It was the federal subsidies and the state subsidies that made fossil fuels so widespread.
Right, and fossil fuel subsidies never expire. The depletion allowances, those are permanent. Where, you know, I've been the vice president of the Iowa Wind Energy Association for almost 15 years. Our subsidies in the wind industry are like a roller coaster. They come in for a few years, then they go out. And the same with the solar industry. We're phasing out the investment tax credit right now for the solar industry. The wind energy production tax credit is already gone. You know, that, you know, say what you want about him, but that was Chuck Grassley that put that in a long, long time ago. He is the godfather of the wind industry. The fastest growing jobs in America are wind turbine technician and solar panel installer. Iowa has over 10,000 jobs in the wind industry and over 1,000 jobs in the solar industry. The biggest growth area in solar is offshore wind. 75% of America's population lives within 75 miles of a shoreline that you, even say the Great Lakes, you could put wind turbines out in the Great Lakes, and those turbines are a lot bigger than the terrestrial turbines. So Iowa, we're number one. We're up to 42% of our electricity now in wind. It's great, but you know, Mid-American still has 6 coal plants open, so that's a problem too. So you know, transmission is a problem. We don't have enough transmission to get all the wind energy that we want to produce out of Iowa. It's actually stalled the wind industry in Iowa because of lack of transmission. So there's many things that, and the Green New Deal addresses that. The infrastructure jobs that the Green New Deal would provide would be good jobs, they'd be green jobs, and they would be union jobs. So the Green New Deal is the answer to a lot of this. Now, it's really not legislation. It is more of a framework of where we need to go. But the most important thing is that we need to get better legislators at the local, the state, and the federal level. And that's where you come in, Kimberly. We need people that believe that climate change is a crisis, that need to attack it, like Bridget said, as it's World War III. And in the crisis we're in, there's three big crises right now. There's the COVID, the economic crisis, and the climate crisis. They can all be solved together by using the framework of the Green New Deal to provide better. I mean, we need to rebuild our food system. We need to rebuild our energy system, our infrastructure. Our roads and bridges are falling apart. The Green New Deal is a works program, just like there was in the Great Depression. And we're up to almost 20% unemployment now, and we might not even be at the peak of unemployment. We don't know how long this is going to last. This could be worse than the Great Depression. So the Green New Deal and a green recovery is where we need to focus in a lot of this, because it incorporates all this, maybe even a tax on carbon. So I'm not against a tax on carbon, Phil. I just want to tax it all. So.
Yeah, and I think we have to be really careful about, it's too bad, but that it comes down to this in a lot of cases. But if we don't flip the U.S. Senate, if we don't get somebody different in the White House, we're going to have at least 4 more years of stalling, and not even just stalling, of going backwards. All these regulations are getting relaxed. There's no enforcement by the EPA of anything, basically. I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, and somebody mentioned about, it was a couple paragraphs back in our discussion about, and it made me think this. I can't remember what the comment was that triggered it, but why are all of our state buildings, our city buildings, our county buildings, our federal buildings, why aren't they all powered by, why don't they all have solar panels on them? Why? I mean, to me, that's such low-hanging fruit. If we're serious as a nation about the climate crisis, why at least are not every single government-owned building or government entity run on solar or wind? Like that just seems like, I was talking to, I think it's Jason at Moxie Solar in North Liberty, owner of Moxie Solar. And, we were talking about that, and I asked him that, and he said, "That's a great question, Kimberly." Like, obviously he owns a solar energy company, and his company, by the way, has been growing and growing, exponentially the last several years, which is great. But it could be growing even more, and it should be growing even more, and there should be even more companies. Also, something that just pinged my mind is, you mentioned about jobs, Bridget. One of the jobs that people could have is manufacturing solar panels, because guess what? They come from China. And so one of the things Jason was telling me that he wished really, really hard that he could get his solar panels that he's installing everywhere made in the United States by union labor who are paid well and have good benefits and a pension and all that stuff. But he has to get his solar panels from China because he cannot get them here. Now, I don't know if there are any solar panel manufacturers in the United States. Maybe there's just a few. I don't know the statistics, but, I believe that in Senator Elizabeth Warren's, if you go to her presidential run campaign page, there's something that she was proposing that I think is, again, one of these puzzle pieces called her green manufacturing plan. And it involved heavy investments in research and development for green technologies and products, that are green products, and that one of the key pieces of that green manufacturing plan was that the feds would commit purchasing from these companies so that they would already have a market immediately, so that they could be, they could be going concerns basically from startup. And so we have to come at this from all different angles, as automation continues to encroach on people's jobs, especially people with, some people with not super high levels of education, but even people with high levels of education, we're losing jobs. And so we've got to find other other ways for people to work, and employing people in all of these green industries and replacing essentially all of our infrastructure with different advanced infrastructure can provide those jobs. But it's gonna be a lot of work, and it has to be done fast. And I just don't so far feel that much of a sense of urgency from Congress as a whole. Now, there's definitely individual people in Congress that get it, but there has to be a critical mass of people like me in Congress, or we just don't have the votes. We can talk about it all day long, but if we don't have the votes to pass this stuff because we're not in the majority, we're not going to win. So, like most things, this is happening from the bottom up. This is happening as people become more and more educated about what our future is going to be like if we don't take a massive action immediately. And people just have to stop electing people who aren't going to do everything they can to take immediate action on it. We have several questions here. Somebody says, what barrier removal or incentives could help farmers transition to regenerative practices or help young people become regenerative farmers who use regenerative agriculture practices?
That's a good
Where
one.
are you, Susan? Susan, calling Susan.
That's a good question. The answer is the Farm Bill. And when we get a Democrat as a senator from Iowa, both Grassley and Ernst are on the Senate Agricultural Committee.
Yeah.
They're the ones with the House Agricultural Committee that write the Farm Bill, which is our budget for agriculture. What you need to do is incentivize good practices and not incentivize things you don't want. What we incentivize is the monocropping of this state, corn and beans, by providing federal tax and insurance, crop insurance. But if you're growing tomatoes or carrots or anything else, you can't get insurance. So we need to, people say, I value this. But I say, hey, let me take a look at your budget, and I'll tell you what you value. We really don't incentivize any regenerative agricultural processes. And so what we need is no-till and cover crops and more diversification. And that more diversification is real food. And we also need to incentivize, instead of giving guaranteed loans for people to build CAFOs, we need to maybe pay them to do regenerative agriculture, or putting livestock back on pasture. 95% of our meat, dairy, and eggs come from CAFOs. That's just horrendous. If you've ever seen or knows what goes on in a CAFO, it's nasty. And we really shouldn't be eating that kind of food. And then, of course, they're processed in those slaughterhouses, and the deplorable conditions akin to slave labor in those. So we need to change our food system. Part of that is how we spend our food dollars, and voting with our dollars and voting with our fork. But the other thing is, and then the big thing is changing the Farm Bill. And so putting in those practices in the Farm Bill, and you can do standalone bills as well, but the Farm Bill is really where it's at. And Iowa senators always sit on the Senate Ag Committee. So Kimberly, get ready for that.
Right, exactly. And that's what I tell people when they ask about this. I say, so good to know that what I'm saying, you're echoing, Mike, because I know you know a lot about this issue. I will say to people, yeah, those farm bills that we see, every few years, how about if those actually supported sustainable and regenerative practices and removed supports and subsidies for these multinational, industrial agricultural companies? First of all, I think they'll make it just fine without that. Second of all, if we want farmers to start transitioning and switching, we talk a lot about transitioning things here with climate. We want farmers to start being able to afford to transition to a more sustainable and regenerative style of agriculture and grow food that we can eat here in Iowa so that we have better food security. Then we have to start paying them to do that. And so we have to start paying farmers to install wetlands around the edges of their land. And we have to start paying them to put in buffer, and paying them, an incentive or a subsidy to make that transition, because that transition isn't going to just happen with a magic wand. It's going to cost money, and it's going to take time to transition their farming operations. And they're barely hanging on by their fingernails, or not, as it is. They're going bankrupt at a higher rate than since the back in the farm crisis days. We have high increase in farmer suicides. Our farmers here in Iowa are in despair, and they've in so many cases lost control and autonomy. It might be their land, maybe, but that's it. Otherwise, everything else is dictated to them, and we've got to give them the freedom to do what I believe the majority of them would like to do. I can't remember who I was talking to the other day. Oh, I think might have been Ruby Bodeker, who's running for Iowa House. And she was saying that she's talked to sort of our elders who farmed, 50 years ago, who are still living, and she'll have conversations with them. And they have, of course, changed their farming operations to reflect this go big or go home, what we have incentivized through our systems and through our laws. And she'll say to them, if you could go back to how you farmed 40 or 50 years ago, would you do it? She always asks people that, farmers that she knows who've been farming for 50 years. And she said, to a person, they get this smile on their face, like remembering what that was like. And they'll say, well, yeah, but I can't afford to. I can't go back to that. And so we have to make it so that farmers who want to farm that way can. Darrow, as far as helping young people become farmers, I mentioned Susan at SILT, Sustainable Iowa Land Trust. Sustainable Iowa Land Trust is a nonprofit that is fantastic, and they connect land with new farmers. And those new farmers, there's some parameters as to the type of farming that they can do on the land that they get connected with. But that's, we actually did one of these forums, so you can look that up on our videos page here on the Facebook or on our website. But go watch that conversation with Susan, because that was a really good conversation about what you're asking about here.
That's really important, because the average farmer in Iowa is almost 60 years old. And most of our farms are owned by women, and those farms, because they're widows, so many of those farms are going to change hands in the next 10 years. But who's going to buy them? And we need the people that want to grow real food to buy them, or to be able to farm them. Iowa imports more of its own food than any other state in the lower 48, because we don't really grow food in Iowa. We grow corn and soybeans, and the corn and soybeans go to animal feed, biofuels, and a little bit of the corn goes to high fructose corn syrup, which is not food, it's just a food additive. So you could walk from here to Des Moines, from Iowa City where I'm at, and you would starve to death because you would not find enough food to sustain you in that hike. And so, this whole notion that Iowa feeds the world, it's a bunch of BS. We need to move to a system where we feed our community, and we get our food from local farmers, whether that's the CSA or a farmer's market, or even the local grocery stores buying food that's within 50 to 100 miles of those stores. That's the kind of system, and that's kind of the system we had 50 years ago. We had so many different crops, and now we have basically two.
Right, and you have to support that. Some people mistakenly think, well, okay, let them just go do that. Let them just go be a local farmer and grow food and sell it. But you have to provide the structure for that, and you have to provide a way for them to make a living at it. And so it's not, it takes the farmers willing to do it, which I believe most of them are, but you have to support it with the farm bills and the things that we're currently providing, the supports we're currently providing to our current system, which is not sustainable. Oh my goodness.
Providing that structure for people to grow food locally and independently is also a solution to the COVID-19 pandemic, because people are hungry right now. In my day job, I run something called the Pantry Pickup Project, where we deliver food to homebound residents. And I've delivered food to people who live right across from a farm, but they're hungry, And so it's just like Mike's saying, where people can't get food when they're right next to a farm. So I just think that's really important right now as we're looking for solutions that are overlap with the climate crisis and the COVID-19 crisis.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go back to something you said regarding the regen agriculture, and that we should be paying farmers for the environmental services that they provide, wetlands, buffer strips, etc. Well, one of our biggest carbon sinks on the planet is the soil. And so we can plant a tree, but we can also bury a tree. That tree becomes soil and it keeps the carbon in the ground with it. Well, we can also bury a corn stalk. And through regenerative agriculture, we actually build carbon in the soil. And so by paying farmers for removing that carbon from the air and putting it in the soil, they develop a new revenue stream that gets away from this monocropping situation where it's like it's all about extracting as much as I can from it. It's much more as how much can I put into my soil. And
That's right, Phil. That's farming is an extraction business, and the current soil in Iowa is almost dead. I mean, so many inputs on it, and you can tell by the color of it. The color of the soil in Iowa is no longer really black like it used to be, and the blackness in the soil is really carbon. That's what gives it the color. And so most of our soil, it's so dry, there's not enough living matter into the soil. There's no worms in it. It's hard as a rock, most of it. I mean, it is, we're treating our soil like dirt, and we need to stop doing that.
Wait, I think we need to get Mike Draper on the line. I'm seeing a new t-shirt here. Stop treating our soil like dirt. Come on, Reagan, you can do it.
I think that comes from Ray Brown up in North Dakota. I think I stole.
Oh, okay.
I always steal the best lines from other people, and it's Bill McKibben. But you know, one of the things I like to say is that if you eat, you're involved in agriculture. So there's 90% fewer farmers than there were in 1970 in this country. 90% fewer, and the farmers don't have a strong enough voice. So they need the people that eat the food to be in coalition with them to give us that kind of agricultural system that we really need that's regenerative. So that we need feeders and eaters to get together and form a coalition, if you will. And that's what the Farm Bill was originally. And that's why SNAP benefits are actually in the Farm Bill, was to get urban legislators on board with farm legislators, you know, from rural areas, so they would have something in common. So people said, why are SNAP benefits, you know, food stamps, why is that in the Farm Bill? It was because to build that coalition of basically the feeders and the eaters to move forward on the Farm Bill. And unfortunately, those multinational corporations have basically controlled it since the 70s, when Earl Butz said, you know, go big or go home. You know, it's all about efficiency, right? And not about food. Yeah.
Well, and then, you know, we have the wonderful and charming Mr. Perdue, who is, you know, telling farmers basically to just, you know, so sad, too bad. If you can't go big, I guess you're just going to go out of business, which is not exactly what the Secretary of Agriculture should be saying. Joseph, we have a lot of questions built up here. Joseph says, what can you do? I'm assuming he means me, but I'll take suggestions from all of you in the Senate to reduce solar panel tariffs coming in from China. Like I mentioned, that sounds like a business opportunity to me. And if you know, we need to help provide startup capital, and we need to get more solar panel companies in the United States, paying people good wages, being unionized. How about this even? What if the workers at a solar panel company actually got like profit sharing? Company did well, they get a little more money. You know, that sounds like a pretty nice deal. There's certainly a lot of different companies that have profit sharing built into their pay structure.
So what if you actually provided incentives in the solar investment tax credit for domestic content? I mean, they did that in 2008 when Obama was president, and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Those original solar tax credits gave you a bump if you bought domestic content, if you bought U.S. panels. But those have been phased out, so that's no longer there. So, you know, sometimes you have to incentivize what you want, and sometimes tax what you don't want. So,
right. Yep. Exactly. Joseph also asks, what can we do to protect workers' rights within the United States while making it economically viable for companies to use American workers, especially for green industries? Yeah, I mean, I think that we see a theme here that we just need to make those investments. And you're never going to hear me say free anything, just spoiler alert. I don't use the term free college, free healthcare, free whatever. I will never say that. The reason I say that is because I think words matter. Words are important, and you need to really be careful about communication. And those things all cost something. But what I say a lot is we need to make those investments. And the reason I say we need to make those investments, what I'm still telling you is that it's going to take money. It's going to take federal money. But the reason I put it that way is because I'm confident that those investments are going to be investments and pay off. I understand sometimes you make investments, they don't pay off. But I believe that these investments that I'm talking about, investments in healthcare, investments in childcare, investments in regenerative agriculture, investments in workers, investments in American manufacturing will pay off. And so we have to investments. So as far as protecting worker rights, Joseph, I mean, protecting worker rights, we need more unions. We need unions to have more teeth. We need unions to have more power. My dad, my mom, my son's father, my grandfather, my stepdad, and I have all been either lifelong union workers or have been union workers for a substantial amount of our lives. I was a union flight attendant for 13 years, walked a picket line, and was a volunteer organizer to try to keep B-Scale from coming to American Airlines. So I understand, having grown up with my mom and dad, both lifelong union workers, how important unions are to a stronger middle class. So that's a huge piece of what we need to do as we do all of this to transition to a better planet, a healthier planet. We need to also take care of work, like Bridget was saying, take care of workers at the same time. The beauty of it is it's both and. It's not take care of the planet or take care of work. Like it's not, that's a false choice. It's actually a really nice synergy where we can do all these things that we need to do to make our planet livable into the future, while we also provide good paying jobs. You know, that's what the original New Deal was all about, was about doing all this infrastructure, creating all these infrastructure projects, and paying people a living wage. And, you know, we rode on that for quite a long time. I mean, the New Deal was part of why the 50s and 60s had the amount of overall prosperity, not for everyone, but for in general that they had economically. We left behind in a big way women and people of color in the New Deal. But I think we know that, and that's something that those who have drafted the Green New Deal are very well aware of, and that we plan not to have happen this time. So this is a far more inclusive plan.
And the way that we make sure that that doesn't happen this time is that Black and brown people are at the table when we're having these conversations about policy. And in addition to labor unions and workers having a stake in their company, they need to have a stake in this policy. So for example, when the Sunrise Movement was working with the city of Cedar Rapids to develop their climate resolution, there was a stipulation in there that fossil fuel workers need to be part of a committee when the climate action plan is being created. And so that type of legislation needs to be created everywhere.
We also notice in this COVID crisis that the United States, North America, is the high cost producer of fossil fuels in the world, and they're acting on a global market. So it's very difficult to protect the worker when you can't protect the company to stay in business. But it's really hard to import wind. It's really hard to import the sun. Moving to a renewable base and transitioning our workers from a fossil fuel extractive industry to a renewable energy industry automatically protects our workers.
Right. Yeah, exactly. My son has a 2-year welding degree. He's got a welding certification. Yes, you can automate some spot welding, on an assembly line type thing, but you can't automate a custom weld job, for a custom project or on a job site. And now he's working. They got laid off because of COVID, but I think they're going back soon. Now he's a helper with the IBEW, an electrician's helper. So he's gaining that skill as well. E.g. jobs that cannot be outsourced.
Yeah. And
so hopefully.
Those two jobs, the two fastest growing jobs in America, wind energy technician and solar panel installer, They cannot be outsourced to a call center in Mumbai, Mexico, Southeast Asia. Those are jobs right here. We really need to unionize those industries. I think there's only one union solar company in the state. That's not enough. I don't think that most of the wind industry in the state is also not unionized.
Right.
You actually saw one of the COVID hotspots was in Newton with the blade manufacturer. I don't think that's a union shop either. Their worker rights and their protections there. The meat packing industry or the slaughterhouse industry, most of that is non-union as well. So we're not protecting those worker rights. All these jobs, I mean, the percentage, we started breaking up the unions when Ronald Reagan broke up the flight controllers in 1980.
Yeah.
And it's been on a downward slide ever since on busting out unions. We need to rebuild the union movement within this country, and the Green New Deal is all about that.
Right. And two things there. I mean, one thing is building on what Bridget said, I agree that it seems to me, just looking, I understand, I'm looking from the outside in, and I'll have a very interesting other perspective, I'm sure, when I'm in. But looking from the outside in, it looks to me like so many of our laws are discussed and then implemented, passed, without anyone ever really listening very much to the people that they're going to affect the most. And that makes no sense to me.
Or even reading the bill.
Or even reading the bill, right. Oh, it's 900 pages. Vote yes or no tomorrow. Here it is. Like, what? Why is it necessary to vote on a bill in one day? Like, literally, there is no reason why. People should have the chance to read it and to have some discussion on it. I understand there's emergency type situations where we need to move on things, but yeah, that's just ridiculous. And we also need to unionize. And people sometimes ask me, why do you talk about unions so much? It's because corporations inherently have so much power. They're signing your paycheck. If they don't want to pay you or whatever, they're the ones with the checkbook in their hand, figuratively. And so the only thing to try to counter that power that you have by being the company is to have workers in solidarity, together, banding together to try to be a counterweight, to balance that power. And ultimately, that there has to be more of a dialogue and more of a balance there, because if the power differential is like this, corporations, workers, then unfortunately, worker pay and conditions will typically just keep going down. I mean, if you have no power to do anything else, this company is just going to keep hiring people who are going to work for less and less and give them fewer and fewer benefits. Now, good companies, smart companies, treat their workers well and pay their workers well and value their workers. And there are some of those in the United States and in the world. And we need to, give them a big round of applause, because they're in the minority, unfortunately. But there are absolutely some great companies, big corporations out there that try to do right by their workers and do well. But we also need to unionize professions and jobs that have not been historically very unionized. When I was little, I think grocery store clerks, the people that checked you out at the grocery clerk, were unionized pretty heavily. And those unions got busted. And I don't think very many, if any, I don't know the answer to this, but grocery store clerks, checkers, clerks, I don't think they're, by and large, are not unionized anymore. And that job used to pay a lot more, like even if adjusted for inflation when I was little. People that are servers, people that are childcare workers. I'm already working on the American Child Care Act, which is legislation that I hope to pass that will make a universal federal child care subsidy available so that everyone can actually afford child care. And will also have provisions for unionizing childcare workers and paying them a lot more than they make. These people are caring for the most vulnerable in our society, people that are infants and toddlers and that cannot tell you if they're not being cared for properly. And they're with these caregivers all day. And yet they're some of the worst paid jobs in our country, just like home health aides who come into people's homes who have people with disabilities, like my friend Tucker, like my friend Alex in Sioux City, and my friend Eric in Waterloo. And they've talked about, they have such a turnover of in-home caregivers because they're not paid well and they're not unionized, and it's not a career type job because it doesn't pay you enough for it to be that. And so as soon as somebody can leave and do something that pays better, sometimes they do. That was a tangent. Okay, now we only have it's all interrelated though. I think that's the lesson of this, is that again, it's not like this or this or this or this. It's all interlocking puzzle pieces, and we need to do all of these things. Darrow said, is there any currently introduced legislation that would end fossil fuel subsidies? I don't know, Darrow. I don't think I can. The House is going to have to introduce that, right?
I'm not aware of any other than there are several similar bills to the Energy Innovation Act which have other clauses in them. They were introduced many by the same people as kind of like fodder for committee. So that's kind of like, while there are other bills that are effectively minor changes of the Energy Innovation Act, there are some other bills out there too. But there are, unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the website that kind of has a bill tracker along those lines. Try Googling bill tracker.
Okay. Joseph, good question. Joseph, you have a lot of great questions. How can public institutions like state universities push for sustainability when desperately trying to reduce costs for taxpayers and students?
Renewable energy is cheaper in the long run. And I think that part of that is there could be legislation that's put in place to help bridge that gap. I mean, oftentimes that their budgets are an annual budget. They don't have much of don't get to plan very far ahead. But when you look at your expenditures over 10 and 20 years, you are better off to go renewable today rather than paying the fossil fuel based generation over the long term. So if there was something we could do on the finance perspective of educational institutions making green bonds available to them or something like that, where they could pay for the infrastructure investments today with their savings over the next 20 years, it would be something we could do there. I think.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that about, if you can make that investment up front, it costs money then, but then you're better off, in the long term by far. I was talking to somebody the other day who's a gentleman who works in, I can't remember the exact company that he worked for or exactly his job, but it was in the energy field. And he was saying, these little incentives that they put out, like replace your refrigerator, right? Replace your 20-year-old refrigerator or 30-year-old refrigerator, because they used to last that long. Replace that with, a brand new model that's far more energy efficient, and we'll give you a $200 rebate, right? Or whatever. Well, that sounds great if you're a middle income or an upper income person. You can do that all day long. Sure, I'll get a new fridge, give me my $200. But if you're somebody who can't afford to replace your old ancient energy sucking refrigerator or your old energy sucking furnace, then not only do you have higher utility bills than you need to have, which is hurting your monthly cash flow, but you can't afford to go replace it to get that, kickback that they're going to help you replace it. Well, you still can't afford the portion you have to pay. So this goes back to, things like making investments in infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I think of a lot of things. And one is things like the furnaces in people's homes. Like, how are we heating individual homes or apartment buildings? Because when we can reduce those energy costs on a monthly basis, that's going to essentially put more pockets into the put more money into the pockets of people that don't have enough money to get by and to begin with, but they can't do that on their own. And so we have to make those investments. Go ahead,
Kimberly,
Mike.
most of those poor people are renters as well. And when
Yes.
you rent, your landlord a lot of times just has a refrigerator that works and just
Right.
has an air conditioner that works. Now, those are not normally energy efficient, but we need to provide a way that landlords provide better and more efficient appliances, because right now, usually the renter pays the utility bill. Now, it's just common economics that when you lower your utility bill, and if 50% in Iowa or 60% now of your electricity is coming from fossil fuels, if you use less electricity, that's better for it's always the first thing I talk about: energy conservation, which is using less energy, turning your thermostat down and putting on a sweater. The energy efficiency might be putting in more efficient windows, putting in more efficient appliances. Energy efficiency usually costs about 2 cents a kilowatt hour, and electricity costs 10 to 15 cents a kilowatt hour. So energy efficiency is the low-hanging fruit. They call it megawatts. And so we always have to remember that when we're doing renewable energy, the first thing you do is do efficiency. Because I took my house, I bought it 20 years ago, I reduced the energy usage in half. Now, I can't afford solar panels, but if I did, I would only have to have half the number of solar panels to electrify and get 100% renewable energy in my house, but by just using energy efficiency. So that's something that we can't forget.
And I also want to say that energy efficiency is so important. Weatherizing our homes is going to be critical to solving this crisis, but I want to remember to keep our eyes on the prize a little bit. And what I mean by that is not getting upset by your friend who's, not keeping the lights off, because according to the Climate Accountability Institute, 90 companies alone are responsible for about 2/3 of all emissions that we put out since the Industrial Revolution. About 20 of those companies are responsible for 1/3 of those emissions. So it's really important that we, while doing community-based work, you, just like Ayla sitting on city council steps, just like the protesters who, when Greta Thunberg came and were outside the University of Iowa, that work is so important to the solution to this crisis, but it's also important that we talk about systemic transformative change.
Yeah. I mean, I remember back in, was it Jimmy Carter? I seem to vaguely remember some president.
Put on your sweater?
Yes.
Yes.
He took a lot of grief for that.
It's Carter, but actually Nixon was the first to make the put on your sweater speech.
I mean, it may sound eye-rolling to some people, but seriously, like, why aren't we talking about and messaging? Why aren't our leadership saying things like, your thermostat, unless you have a medical reason, unless you have elderly people in your home or some medical reason why you can't do this, why is your thermostat at 75 in the winter? What the hell are you doing? Why is your thermostat not at no higher than 68 or whatever?
Well, they're afraid to ask for personal sacrifice. Americans, and I think it was Bridget talked about a mobilization, a wartime mobilization. When we were in World War II, there was sacrifice. You had gas stamps. You couldn't buy nylons. Pantyhose, if you will. There's all sorts of things that we ask Americans to sacrifice. What are we asking Americans to sacrifice now for the climate crisis? I ask you that.
And we're not just talking about personal sacrifice. We're talking about a better world. We're talking about a better way of life for people. We're talking about more leisure time for people, better wages for people, cleaner air for people, better transit system so that you can get around, so that you're not stuck in your car. Agriculture that's growing food for you right down the street. I just want to remind people, especially during this time where, we're going to maybe lower carbon emissions like 8% during this COVID-19 crisis. This is a blip. And I want to remind people that this sacrificing that we're doing of not driving our cars, this is not the way of change. What we're talking about is a better way of living. And it's going to be hard to get there, but it's what we have to do, and it's going to be worth it in the end. And I really do think that it's going to be a better way of life.
I'd like to direct you to the climatecommunication.yale.edu site. It's got great information regarding people's perceptions of climate. And it's a lot of surveys, and you drill down to the county level. And one of the unfortunate things that I've seen is that people while they're concerned about climate change, they won't pay $10 a month to solve it. So we do need to address that, but we have a good base of people who are concerned about it. We need to build on that and say, you know what, $10 a month is a deal. And I think this COVID crisis tells us that you know what, sometimes a little bit of preparation goes a long way.
Yeah. Okay, we've got just a couple minutes left, and then we want to respect everybody's time. Somebody asked if they can meet my cat. This is Mr. Lovebug. Mr. Lovebug has only one eye. You can't see his other eye because it's sewn shut because he had an injured eye when he was brought into Animal Rescue League. Oh, he's pretty old now. He's an old man. He's probably about 12 now, 13, 14. I don't know because I don't know how old he was when I adopted him. But Mr. Lovebug lives up to his name. They've named him that at the shelter, I think, because he's black and he had only one eye. And I don't know if you guys know this, but black animals are harder to be adopted out than animals of other colors. So, and then he had only one eye. So I think they were really afraid he wouldn't get adopted. So they named him Mr. Lovebug, adorable, right? But he's like the most people person. He's always purring in your face and just wants to be around you. And he's a sweetie. We had a little scare with him about 1.5 years ago. I had to take him to Ames, to the vet clinic there. He has a heart issue, so I have to give him medication twice a day now, and I'm very lucky that I can afford to do that. But yeah, that's Mr. Lovebug. And then we have Sunshine. You might have seen her jumping up over here. She's the yellow one. Sunshine was found in my shed behind my house, and she was a feral cat who's sort of semi-feral now. Like she had kittens in the shed, so I got them all adopted out when they were old enough, and then brought her in the house and sort of forced her to become semi-domesticated. So she'll run away from you if you try to walk up to her, but she's sort of domesticated. Then we have a dog, Theo, who's upstairs. He was adopted from Heinz 57 Rescue, and he's kind of looks like a cow. He's black and white with big black and white splotches. Anyway.
And do they support the Green New Deal?
Huh?
And do they support the Green New Deal?
They do. They love it. They're big fans. They're big fans.
Pets for climate action.
Yeah, I'm not so sure how they're going to feel potentially, you know, knock on my wooden head. We don't know, who knows, but I'm not so sure they're going to feel about moving. But yeah, to be honest, I don't know how I feel about moving. I mean, yeah, I want to do all this work, but I don't know, DC. Anyway, but you know, you do what you got to do. You go where you got to go to do the things you want to get done. So that's cool. And I'm sure there's lots of cool things in DC too, but let's see. I think that's it. Other questions that we didn't answer. If you didn't get your question answered, please feel free to, I'll try to get these questions off of the QA here. But you can also just send them directly to me. Kimberly at KimberlyForIowa.com, Kimberly at KimberlyForIowa.com. That's my email address. I personally look at that every day. I don't delegate answering constituents or voters' questions to staff, much to my staff's chagrin. I spend a lot of time answering people's questions myself. So you'll probably get an answer from me directly if you have a question. Ayla, what would you like to say to wrap us up?
Pulling the rug out from under me. I guess I just really think that now is a very important time to think about the fact that, as Bridget mentioned, and I think everybody sort of spoke on, that the climate crisis is related to so many other issues, and all the people who are disproportionately affected by the economic crisis and the COVID-19 crisis are going to be disproportionately affected by climate change as well. And despite the fact that we're staying home and protecting each other, I think that it's really important to remain as active as possible, whether it's joining groups like Sunrise or even just phone banking for people like Kimberly or, for my case, Ruby in Cedar Rapids. But I just really think it's important not to lose hope and to become stagnant during this weird sort of hiatus that we're in. I think it's important to stay active, and that's really the biggest hope we have right now.
Yeah. Emily, you have any parting words for us?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely second everything that she said. You know, voting is really important, and just being educated in everything that's going on, and supporting people that are definitely affected by all this crisis. Yeah.
Yeah. Bridget.
How do I end this? No, I don't want people to think that COVID-19 erases the climate crisis. And I also don't want people to think that they're unrelated. People don't have access to clean water. People don't have access to food. People don't have access to clean air. People are struggling and people are dying right now because of both crises. And this is a wartime effort. And the other side of it is not, like I said earlier, it's not sacrificing something. It's a visionary future that's going to be better for everybody.
Yep.
And vote.
Vote, yeah, and not only vote, but here's the thing: pick 10 of your friends out of your phone and text them and tell them who you're voting for and why. Notice I'm assuming you're all supporting me, but even if you're not, I'm very serious. People, why do we go to Amazon.com and look at reviews before we buy something, even if we don't buy it from Amazon? Because people listen to other people. Why are there reviews on almost every website now? That's just human nature. We kind of believe what other people say, right? So it's so important, and it's something I couldn't buy, even if I had millions of dollars to loan my own campaign, which I don't. It is that word of mouth and telling your friends and family and people that you personally know who you're supporting in this U.S. Senate race or for any other office, for state office, for Iowa State House, and why you're supporting them to garner their support, because that's really, even during COVID-19, that's the most powerful thing that we have, is people telling other people. So Mike, you have any final words?
Sure. I couldn't agree more about voting, but it's who you vote for that really matters. We need to elect people at every level that are willing to stand up for the people and the planet versus the polluters. And so we need people that have the intestinal fortitude to stand up against the Farm Bureau, to stand up against the Koch brothers, the fossil fuel billionaires that are destroying our planet and our future and the future of our children and grandchildren, all for short-term profits. That's why it really matters who you vote for at every level. And it also matters, what you personally do, where you buy your food, who you buy your food from. So I'm working a lot with LULAC and a lot of civil rights groups on boycotting corporate meat. And so if you choose to eat meat, a lot of people are going with a plant-based diet. I choose not to, but I choose to buy my meat from sustainably raised sources. I know my farmer. I buy it directly from a farmer, and I know how it was raised. And so if you choose to eat meat, try not to buy corporate meat, because you're just feeding into that oppressive system that is not good for anybody. It's not good for the workers. It's not good for you, and it's not good for the planet. So
Yeah.
I really thank you for inviting me to be on. This has been a great discussion. I think we could probably go on for a couple more hours, but I know I have a family dinner, a socially family dinner tonight. So thank you.
Yeah. Phil, do you have any final words for us?
Sure, I'm going to steal something from a great environmentalist, climate scientist, Dr. Catherine Hayhoe from Texas. Look up her YouTube channel, Global Weirding. It's co-produced with PBS. They're really cool short videos on climate. But anyway, she says that our most powerful tool in the climate crisis is our voice. And so talk to your friends. Just talk about it. Talking about climate change is our most powerful weapon. So keep talking.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for being here to have this conversation today. If we squeak by and win this primary in a true David and Goliath story, then we'll definitely do more of these climate events between now and November. So we'll call you all back then and get the band back together. So thanks, everybody.
Happy Mother's Day.
All right. Thank you. Happy Mother's Day.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.